The air was heavy with an oppressive stillness as Eleanor Whitmore arrived at Blackthorn Hill, the ancestral estate she had inherited under unusual circumstances. It loomed ahead like a relic forgotten by time, its gabled roof sharp against the slate-gray sky. She stood at the iron gate, her gloved hand hesitating on the latch. The journey from New York had been arduous, yet nothing could have prepared her for the estate's grim presence. Its ivy-covered walls seemed to pulsate with secrets, each brick whispering a warning. Eleanor had never met her great-aunt Lavinia, the estate's prior owner, and had only learned of her existence upon the solicitor's letter announcing the inheritance. Lavinia's name was rarely mentioned in the family, her life a quiet scandal erased from memory. As a modern woman of 1912, Eleanor had dismissed such talk as the idle whispers of tradition-bound relatives. Now, standing before the shadowed facade of Blackthorn Manor, she wondered if she had been too quick to ignore those stories. The interior was no less imposing. Dust-laden chandeliers hung precariously over an expansive hall, their crystals refracting what little light seeped through the tall windows. The air carried a faint chill, even as a fire burned weakly in the hearth. "Miss Whitmore, welcome," croaked Mrs. Dodd, the housekeeper. Her small, sharp eyes scanned Eleanor with the precision of a hawk. "I trust your journey was safe." The pause after safe lingered just a little too long, unsettling Eleanor. "Yes, thank you. Though I must confess the weather was rather unkind," Eleanor replied, forcing a polite smile. The corners of Mrs. Dodd's mouth twitched, though whether in acknowledgement or disapproval was unclear. Eleanor's first night was restless. Her quarters, though grand in design, felt oppressively silent. Yet, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, a faint sound stirred her, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firmer than she felt. Silence answered, but the tapping resumed moments later. By morning, Eleanor dismissed the disturbance as the settling of an old house. Determined not to be intimidated by creaking floorboards and nocturnal draughts, she explored the estate. In the library, she discovered a journal tucked behind volumes of poetry. The name Lavinia Whitmore was etched on its cover. Flipping through its pages, Eleanor's breath caught as she read of Lavinia's struggle with the presence, a nameless force that seemed to haunt her. That evening, Eleanor sought out Mrs. Dodd. "What do you know of my great-aunt Lavinia?" she asked. The housekeeper stiffened, her expression guarded. "Miss Lavinia had peculiarities," Mrs. Dodd replied cautiously. "She believed this house bore a curse, one tied to its very foundation. Best not to dwell on such things, Miss Whitmore. Some doors are better left closed." But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the door she needed to open had already begun creaking ajar. Eleanor awoke with the rising sun, her mind restless with fragments of Lavinia's journal. The account teetered between unsettling descriptions of spectral encounters and cryptic references to something called the Mirror Room. Determined to understand her great-aunt's torment, she decided to explore every corner of Blackthorn Manor. The house resisted her efforts. Doors groaned in protest as she pushed them open, revealing rooms long forgotten by time. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through grimy windows. In one such room, Eleanor uncovered a portrait of Lavinia. The woman's dark eyes seemed to follow her, a melancholic shadow clinging to her painted features. On the back of the frame, a single word was scrawled in faded ink: "Beware." By late afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the library again. The room seemed to breathe with a life of its own, the old books creaking as if whispering secrets to one another. As she replaced Lavinia's journal, a draft of air nudged a book from the shelf. It landed with a thud, its cover snapping open. Inside, a yellowed page fluttered to the floor. Eleanor retrieved it, her eyes scanning the spidery handwriting. "To the one who follows me," it began. "Beware the mirror room. It is not merely a place, but a threshold. Do not linger before the glass, for it does not merely reflect. It watches." "Miss Whitmore," came Mrs. Dodd's sharp voice from the doorway, startling Eleanor. "It's nearly supper. You've spent enough time in here for one day." Eleanor nodded, but she couldn't shake the foreboding tone of Lavinia's words. That night, Eleanor's sleep was fractured by unsettling dreams. She wandered the manor in the dark, the hallways stretching endlessly before her. A faint melody played in the distance, growing louder as she approached a door she had never seen before. She reached for the handle, but the moment she touched it, she woke in a cold sweat. The next morning, Eleanor confronted Mrs. Dodd. "There's a room in this house I've yet to find. The mirror room. Where is it?" she demanded. Mrs. Dodd's face turned ashen. "You've no business in that room," she replied, her voice trembling. "It's been locked for decades. It's best left that way." Her curiosity only deepened. That evening, Eleanor searched for the room, guided by instinct and Lavinia's cryptic notes. She found it behind a faded tapestry on the third floor. The door was locked, as Mrs. Dodd had said, but a skeleton key on Lavinia's desk fit perfectly. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. The room was barren, save for an ornate mirror standing at its center. The glass was clouded, as if unwilling to reveal its secrets. As Eleanor approached, her reflection materialized, only it was not quite her. The eyes staring back were darker, shadowed by something malevolent. "Leave," her reflection mouthed soundlessly. A chill ran through Eleanor as the mirror vibrated slightly, the surface rippling like water. She stumbled back, her breath catching. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Eleanor's heart pounded as she stared at the now locked door, her breath fogging in the icy air of the mirror room. The surface of the mirror shimmered faintly, as though it were alive. The unsettling image of her distorted reflection still lingered in her mind. Summoning her courage, she took a step closer to the glass, determined to uncover its secrets. "Lavinia," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened to you here?" The mirror responded with a low hum, the surface rippling like disturbed water. Shapes began to form. A hallway, cloaked in shadow, extending far beyond what the dimensions of the room should allow. Eleanor hesitated, but something beyond her control pulled her toward it. Before she could stop herself, her hand reached out and touched the cold, liquid-like surface. The world shifted. Eleanor found herself standing in a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with faded peeling wallpaper, and a sickly green light emanated from nowhere in particular. The air was heavy, carrying a faint scent of decay. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally as she moved forward, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Hello?" she called, her voice muffled as if the air itself were working against her. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered, startling her. She turned to see a shadowy figure at the end of the corridor. It was Lavinia, or rather, something that wore her face. Her eyes were hollow, her features twisted with anguish. The mirror doesn't just reflect, the figure continued. It traps. It consumes. What do you mean? Eleanor demanded. Lavinia's shade took a step closer, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. I was drawn here, as you were. I thought I could control it, understand it. But the mirror feeds on our fears, our regrets. It shows us what we cannot escape. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as the corridor began to distort. The walls stretched and twisted, and the air filled with a cacophony of whispers. Shadows danced along the edges of her vision, shifting and clawing toward her. You must leave, Lavinia's shade pleaded, her voice breaking. But be warned, there is a cost. How? Eleanor asked, her voice rising with desperation. How do I escape? Lavinia raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the end of the corridor, where a faint glow flickered. Follow the light. Do not look back, no matter what you hear. Without waiting for further explanation, Eleanor ran toward the glow. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. She felt unseen hands grasping at her, cold and clammy, but she forced herself to press on. When she reached the source of the light, she found another mirror, its surface glowing faintly. Without hesitation, she plunged through it. Eleanor collapsed onto the floor of the mirror room, gasping for air. The cold was gone, replaced by a suffocating heat. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the window. The mirror was still, its surface reflecting only her pale, wide-eyed face. But something had changed. The house no longer felt like Blackthorn Manor. The air was different, heavier, and the faint sound of sobbing echoed from somewhere deep within. Eleanor realized she was not yet free. The mirror had let her go, but it had not let her leave unscathed. Eleanor pushed herself up from the floor, her hands trembling. The sobbing echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't Lavinia's voice, but something more guttural, more anguished. Her surroundings were warped, familiar yet wrong. The once grand mirror room now seemed smaller, the walls bowed inward like a cage. Lavinia, she called, but her voice felt swallowed by the oppressive air. A faint shimmer in the corner of her eye drew her attention to the mirror. This time, its surface was fractured, thin lines spidering out like veins of ice. From within, shadows moved, faint outlines of figures clawing against the glass. A terrible realization gripped Eleanor. She was not alone. The sobbing stopped. A voice, low and resonant, reverberated through the room. You've seen too much, Eleanor. Who are you? She demanded, trying to steady her voice. We are the forgotten, the voice replied. The mirror feeds on what you bury. The guilt, the secrets, the shadows of your soul. It binds us here, in the in-between. A figure stepped forward from the shadows within the mirror. It was Lavinia, but she was no longer the spectral shade Eleanor had encountered. Her face was calm, her eyes clear but sorrowful. Eleanor, you must destroy the mirror, she said softly. It's the only way to free us all. Eleanor hesitated. But if I destroy it, what happens to you? To the others? Lavinia smiled faintly, her image flickering. Freedom comes in many forms. What you choose will determine ours. But beware. The mirror will not let go without a fight. The fractured glass began to ripple, and a deep, menacing growl filled the room. The shadows inside the mirror surged forward, slamming against the surface as though testing its boundaries. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. She remembered the fireplace in the study. The iron poker, sturdy and sharp. She ran from the room, the growls and whispers chasing her through the narrow halls. The house seemed alive now, twisting and shifting, the walls closing in. Doors slammed shut behind her, but she didn't stop until she reached the study. Grabbing the iron poker, she felt its weight in her hands, a tangible tether to reality. When she returned to the mirror room, the shadows were spilling out of the glass, pooling on the floor like living ink. Faces twisted and writhed within the darkness, their mouths open in silent screams. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she gripped the poker tightly. "You won't take me," she shouted, raising the weapon high. The mirror's surface shimmered, and a voice boomed. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand." But Eleanor didn't waver. With all her strength, she drove the poker into the heart of the fractured glass. The mirror screamed, a sound that shook the very foundation of the house. Light and shadow exploded outward, knocking Eleanor to the floor. When she opened her eyes, the room was silent. The mirror was gone, its frame shattered and empty. The air was still, the oppressive heaviness lifted. "Eleanor," a voice whispered. She turned to see Lavinia, her form faint but serene. "Thank you." "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face. Lavinia smiled. "We're free, and so are you." As the spirit faded, the house around Eleanor began to change. The warped walls straightened, the suffocating darkness lifted. Morning light streamed through the windows, and for the first time in years, Blackthorn Manor felt alive. Eleanor stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The mirror's curse was broken, its power shattered. Though the memories of the ordeal lingered, she felt a deep sense of peace. She looked back at the house one last time, knowing she had not just faced the ghosts of the manor, but the shadows within herself. And as she walked away, she felt lighter, as though a part of her had been set free.